Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Viega, and this is The Politics of Noise, Digital Music Cultures and Identities in Music Therapy.
So my name is Alex Crooke from the University of Melbourne in so-called Australia. I want to start off by acknowledging that I am on stolen lands and acknowledge that the traditional owners of these lands are the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the East Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, as well as any elders present or emerging that might be joining us today. So I am not a music therapist, but a music therapy scholar and researcher. I have been making beats or making electronic music and practicing as a DJ for over 20 years now. I came into the music therapy field through sociology, and one of the reasons that I sort of came to this topic is that I came into the music therapy space, and found that despite all the amazing stuff that was going on, I wasn't seeing a lot of discourse around the use of electronic music as well as digital music technology or any kind of music technology. And for me, that would really struck me because that was my instruments. That was how I expressed myself musically. These were the musical cultures that I grew up with and that were really important to me in my identity. And so, yeah, I found this really kind of puzzling that there wasn't more of this discourse in music therapy. So that's what kind of brought me to this, and it's one really interested to explore that, and also the health affordances that that music can bring, music technology can bring.
Yeah, thanks. Um, again, my name is Michael Viega, and I'm an assistant professor at Montclair State University. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a white-skinned, able-bodied, neurotypical, cisgendered. I'm within intersectionally a lot of the societal and privileged norms. And so growing up as a white suburban kid, raised on MTV and seeing popular music cultures only through the lens of popular music entertainment and what corporations were selling me, and even images of rebellion seem to be shadowed, and politics seem to be shadowed within Brought to You by Coke, brought to you by the latest trend. It wasn't until my first experiences with rave culture in the mid 90s. I remember my first rave was a drum and bass DJ named LTJ Bookham, and he had an MC with him, and it was the first time that I heard discussion about ecological and climate devastation. The MC was, while LTJ Bookham was playing, was talking about taking the planet back and what was happening to the earth. This was 1995, maybe. It was the first time that I had seen mostly female collective putting on the show. It was a collective in Richmond, Virginia called Love. And it was the first time I had been around a scene where ideals are related around challenging hierarchies and patriarchy and relationship between audience and performer and medium. It was the first time I'd seen and experienced that, and so it was really within that setting as a teenager that I first learned about ideals like this, was engagement with the music scene in the mid 90s. And I think that really what started me on this journey today.
Yep, I think you raise a really great point there, because I remember as also a white able-bodied cisgendered male who grew up on a farm in Australia, so-called Australia. It wasn't until I got down to the city and started going to these sort of underground techno clubs and raves and warehouse parties and all this sort of stuff that I was really introduced to queer culture. And not only introduced to it, but these were spaces where queer culture was front and center. These were spaces where, all of these sorts of things were not, downplayed or anything like that. It was all celebrated and it was front and center. And I think that's really important, and it's, you know, these are some of the cultural legacies, or, you know, the socio-political legacies of some of this kind of music, which is one of the things that we want to try to get across today. And, you know, if we're talking about things like house culture, techno culture, you know, these are coming from places and times when, you know, to be a person of color, to be a queer person, and to go out and celebrate in public, you know, in most mainstream nightclubs or whatever it might be
Yep.
problematic to show your identity in the way that you know, that you identify. So these spaces, so the Warehouse, which was in
Chicago.
Chicago, I believe,
Hmm.
and also something Garage in New York, where
Hmm.
these spaces where people come out, you know, once a week and be themselves, and with no fear of, you know, any kind of reprisal, and celebrate that. And this is how we got house music and garage music, you know. So
It
these are
really
the sort
was
of
a taking over the disco scene, which had been kind of this rich, white, you know, very affluent and privileged scene in the 70s, to taking the music of disco and reclaiming it and turning it into house and, you know, later acid house and all the other forms of techno. But DJs like Frankie Knuckles being, you know, really pioneers and names that music therapists should know, and know how the scene that Frankie Knuckles came in, and understand how it was in Chicago, the Black queer scene that was really at the forefront of the creation of house music and at the Warehouse. And that history may be lost as we are in kind of the 21st century, where house music and especially dub music has kind of been, you know, incorporated and taken over in a lot of ways. And there, you know, a lot of the feminist qualities that seem to be very prevalent in the 90s seems to have been taken over as more of a macho, drop the bass, drop the beat, you know, and explode kind of thing, where that wasn't necessarily what it was about back then.
Mm. And it's, you're right, and you know, we really have seen a colonization and commercialization of, you know, these music genres and cultures. But you know, one of the things that I find interesting, is that, you know, going around the world into different places, there are still things like all female DJ collectives, or
Right.
all non-binary, or all non, you know, male collectives, which are still at that grassroots level, ensuring that there are spaces that people can feel, you know, safe to use that term,
Right.
to go
Exactly.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that we, and well, I'll speak for myself here, is that I'm definitely not an expert in this space. I'm learning every day, and these are the kinds of conversations that I find it really useful, you know, for learning. And so that's another reason why we wanted to kind of show you how a bit of the way how we're sort of thinking through, you know, these music cultures that, even if we're not indigenous to, we're very familiar with, and we have a lot of love and appreciation for, and thinking about why are they not more present in music therapy,
Right.
teaching, theory, practice, and you know, what are the points of attention in bringing these things into that kind of space as well. So
Yeah, I mean, Alex, you've talked a lot about, you know, the gear in digital music, you know, and you know, sometimes undergraduates, you know, may take just a class and learn what MIDI is or learn what Sibelius is, but you know, the gear, the drum machines, the DJ equipment, these have histories and cultures that are attached to them, and
absolutely.
those are very vital. When you're engaging with this, you're engaging not only with all the cool buttons and cool tech, but you're engaging with a whole historical background of this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So, look, if we're looking at music technology, I want to acknowledge that music technology actually started. It was a woman called Alicia Gray who created the first single oscillator synthesizer a year before Graham Bell. Was it Graham Bell who created the telephone? So I just want to, you know, because that's not
Mm-hmm.
named enough, that
Right.
electronic music was basically started by a woman. But okay, so let's fast forward. So turntables were being used in Jamaican sound system culture, playing one record and then the other. This was also happening in jazz and especially in disco. And so in the Bronx in the early 1970s, black and brown young people were starting to use these turntables and really kind of starting to reimagine them, not as something that would just play one song and then play another song, but how they could be used to create new collages or new textures or new arrangements of music and songs, and being able to take things from very different places and kind of create, you know, to the point where people started scratching and actually using them as rhythmic and melodic instruments of their own thing. And, you know, for me, that is my instrument still. That is, if I'm going to improvise, I'm going to improvise on a turntable with the mixer.
Right.
After that, then we get the Roland 808, which if you hear the sounds, everyone will recognize them.
Yeah.
It was released in 1980. It was a complete commercial failure. It was designed to be a backup drummer for a band. And it ceased production 2 years later. It's still one of the most popular, if not influential things for all the popular music, I would say, you know, in the current decade or even in the previous decade.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was through the hip hop members of the hip hop culture taking those sounds and the equipment and thinking like, what can we do with this? And it's had this, you know, they found it had this really kind of deep, low sub bass, and they're like, wow, not sure if it's meant to do that, but that sounds really good for us. We can do that. We can use that. And then we sort of saw this happening, the introduction of sample pads and being able to, you know, grab little bits of sound snippets from everywhere. And I think Marley Marl was famously quoted for saying, you know, I can have a session drummer from the 60s playing over a horn section from somewhere else completely different in the world that was recorded in the late 70s, and I can kind of have them in my studio. So these bits of equipment really do have really strong histories. They've got their own virtuosos. They've got their own these, you know, lore and legend and all these sorts of things.
I think the history, as you were talking about, of engaging in digital musics, is a history of shifting identities, whether it's the vocoder and Afrofuturism and P-Funk to Arca and the exploration of breaking through binaries through digital sound. And thinking about the sound in that way is beyond just, it takes a deep listening, because you're not only listening to the sound, but you're listening to a cultural narrative that is decades in the making. And I want to encourage everybody that this is only the beginning of the conversation, that I feel like in education of music therapy, we often focus on how to adapt music technology as an outcome in therapy, which is beautiful. And I think it's a needed aspect. But what is less talked about is like we said before, like, what is the history and culture of this gear in a way that's not just geared towards an outcome, but that's geared towards the experience and the rituals and the communities and the engagement, the relationships that happen within, because each of these pieces of gear are so different, you know?
They are different, absolutely, and each of them carries with them. And this is the thing that I was going to say, and I wish I had a couple of bits of gear. I'll get some when you're next talking. But these bits of gear, it's like that identity you have, you know, that you may have had if you grow up and you always wanted to be a rock star, or you wanted to play punk or something, and having a guitar and being able to, you know, there's something about that.
Right.
Instantly identifiable aesthetic, and, you know, you can already sort of start to connect on a whole lot of levels. This gear is the same. If you show someone an MPC or an SP404 or something like that, that's just an instant, you know,
right.
way to connect with those people. It carries with it so much kind of, you know, cultural meaning.
Cultural reference points.
Yeah, and traditions. And so, you know, I think that's one of the things that that it's kind of sometimes hard to recognize, because these instruments, and I do call them instruments, you know, are rarely taught within, you know, institutionalized settings. Therefore, they are rarely brought into, training settings for things like music therapy. So
Right.
it's, and it's also very, it's less likely, although I'd say this is changing, less likely that students are going to be coming in proficient in these coming out of a conservatorium background. They're more
Right.
likely to be coming in playing Western instruments. But I think, and it's a lot easier to think about and understand the history of, the more traditional acoustic instruments because, we're taught about that in primary school, that sort of stuff. But so that's one of the things that I want to really get across today is that these instruments, they are instruments, they do have history, they do have meaning.
And you have to, students need to know how Jay Dilla changed music history and not only how he changed it, but what was the musicianship behind it and how was the MPC used towards that effect and what was the history up until that point, because the technology had changed to that point to get to that moment. And the technology is always shifting to allow new voices to emerge. And so I think that's part of it, because as soon as you get to that point where Jay Dilla was messing with the beat in a way that sounded wholly and totally unique at the time, and he was able to not quantize his beats. And what does that mean, that I don't quantize the beat so that it sounds off kilter, but that is its own thing? How could we as therapists actually use that as a technique? Right? Like, like it's an actual therapeutic technique not to quantize. What does that do? And where does that come from? And how does that help? You need to know the history,
So this was a necessarily short presentation, and we're hoping that this discussion at least gives you a bit of an insight into the ways that we're thinking about it, but also some of the history and some of the things that we think are really important, which leads us to our next point. What are some of the key takeaways that we think are important in this space, and for how music technology, where it's at in music therapy. And so for me, I think one of the important things is recognizing the musicality and the instrumentality of these bits of equipment, that these are instruments and that they can be played in that way. I think that, for me, that's one of the really important things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for me, is that within the courses we teach, we must continue to teach how to listen, not only to what the sounds might evoke or how the sounds interact, but to teach the cultural legacies of these sounds. He did, every place in around the globe has its own unique sound markers. And so what does that mean when we go into unique therapeutic and health contexts and help people find their own sound? And that now we have our own sound markers here. And that feels like a very important, that's something you can own. That's something you could take with you. This is the sound of Atlanta, but also this is the sound of our child welfare agency. This is the sound of our hospital. And this is and it brings that sense of collective identity, of like ownership to this.
And I think that, you raised that point, and I think even taking a step back, learn what trap is. How is trap different from hip hop? Is it the same? These are all the sorts of things that I feel if you're going to be working with young people, even people like, I'm 38, even people my age, this is what I would want to be doing in a music therapy session.
Yeah.
If we are not building the literacies around these music cultures, I feel as a discipline, we're going to be not able to connect with the large proportion of, the people that we're wanting to work with. So I think it's really important that, we, that education, music therapy education does start to include, some literacy around the gear, because it is complicated, but, so there's some work to be done there, but also literacy around the music and the music cultures and these sonic markers that are in there as well.